Well, good evening all. This is, as we said, a slightly off the beaten track. There could be a little bit of gliding in this and ridge soaring in it. But so welcome to my life as an African bush pilot. I'll start off with a little bit of history on yours truly. Well, I was born in Scotland and brought up there and emigrated from Scotland to New Zealand at the age of 9. I'd always been mad keen on aviation and loved planes and anything to do with flying. I started gliding at the age of 12 in Christchurch in New Zealand, and at 13 joined the Air Training Corps. And this photograph was taken at one of the final parades that we had. It's sort of the long and the short of it, the tallest and the shortest cadet. And we're sitting in a Bell 47 Sioux helicopter, and these were to feature quite a lot of my early life. I applied and was granted permission by the military, or the Chief of Defence Staff actually, to spend my school holidays and spare time working with the helicopter unit on base. They did the training for helicopter pilots on the Bell 47s, and they also had usually a couple of Bell Huey Iroquois for various tasks, including search and rescue. And by the time I'd finished, they'd done a lot of engineering work, basically general gopher, but they'd also taught me how to fly helicopters, and I was also a trained helicopter crewman. So when kids would come back from school holidays, what did you do on your school holidays? Oh, well, I was on this search and rescue, and I did this and that. So it's slightly a bit off the beaten track, really. At 16, I thought I'd give a try of skydiving, and at 16, I'd had my driving license for just under a year at that stage, and I was currently flying gliders, fixed-wing aeroplanes, and helicopters as well. I joined the New Zealand Air Force as a aircrew trainee, training to work on the back of our anti-submarine aircrafts as an electronics operator. But I've got the sad distinction of being the last person to take a Morse test in the New Zealand Air Force as one of these ranks. Unfortunately, I failed that. They wouldn't let me remuster as a pilot, so I left the Air Force, went back to high school for the remainder of the year. That was just over 2 terms worth, and by the end I'd finished with my A-levels, and I'd also sat and passed all my commercial and instrument ratings. Spent a year doing the flying training, and then spent another year trying to find a job. And my first job really was as a pilot in Kenya. And this was me on my first day as chief pilot for the operation, but I'll go into that a little bit later on. The next big moment in my life was met the future Mrs. Thomson. This is my wife I met. She came out on holiday, and 3 days later we were engaged. But Kenya wasn't a place I felt to have a wife, so we came back to New Zealand, did various freelance jobs flying singles and twins around New Zealand Southern Alps, but eventually got a job right down the south of the country, a place called Invercargill, with an outfit called Southern Air, flying this aircraft, which is the Australian-built N22B Nomad. It's a twin turboprop. It fits in between an Islander and a Twin Otter. The engines on it are the same as you'll find on a Jet Ranger helicopter. Quite a unique machine. The big slab-like wings, the flaps, when they start to deploy, they let the ailerons droop with them. So at full flap, these flat all across the whole trailing edge, and the control is done by spoilers. The wheels on it, I don't know if you can see the pointer, the main wheels on it are the same as the main wheels on a Harrier. So very high flotation devices. So built for short field performance. And one of the tricks you could do with it is that you could drop the flaps gear, put the propellers into what they call the beta range, which means basically zero pitch. So they just act like big air brakes. And to give you an idea of what the performance is, if you were to cross the fuel pumps at Seifert at 3,000 feet, you would land, turn left, and taxi straight into the hangar. You come down at something like 80 degrees, and once you get to within about 3 feet of the ground, you could pull the propellers into reverse thrust. The airplane just squats down onto the ground, and it'll stop in its own length. So it's quite impressive. It carries 14. We changed from that to the Islanders, the Britten-Norman Islanders. Great workhorse. This one's located at the place called Milford Sound, which is a very famous tourist spot. It has an airfield in there, but it was one of the only airfields in New Zealand that no matter what license you had to be checked into it because of its unique characteristics. And including the 2 civil aviation flight ops inspectors, there were only 5 of us that could give multi-engine checkouts in there. It was quite interesting. One of the other things that we used to do on a fairly regular basis was flying onto beaches. Now that's quite a tricky thing to do. The reason is that it's all right if it's a nice day and the sand's nice and dry, but I don't know if you've ever noticed if you've got sort of damp sand and you put your hand on it and you start to shake it backwards and forwards, it goes all soupy. Well, that's called liquefaction. And the problem is that if you've got the engine idling over, there's enough vibration in there to cause liquefaction around the wheels, and before you know it, you're sunk up to the belly of the aeroplane. So if you were delivering freight or people on a damp day, you'd have to open the little door, well, it's quite a big door, just behind this engine in here, and just get everybody to jump out and throw stuff out. And as a pilot, you would occasionally have to undo your straps, clamber over the seats, chuck stuff over, and just keep an eye out the window to make sure that you were A, going straight down the beach, and you weren't going A, too fast, or B, too slow. And occasionally, as you lightened the load, you'd have to sort of clamber back over the seats and pull the throttles back a little bit. So it was a little bit sporty at times. We came to the UK, back to the UK, and I got a job at Southend flying for an outfit there, flying King Airs of different marks on night work mostly, courier flights and mail, newspapers. And, so that was quite a culture shock, coming from the wilds of Africa and New Zealand to flying over Europe. You know, I just couldn't believe the amount of light that you see at nighttime. I finished up on that company as a line trainer on the Shorts 330, you know, the old shed. And, somebody one asked what it was like to land in a crosswind, and a wit said it was very good to stand behind. That sums it up. And from there, I moved to Britannia Airways, onto the charter firm, flying the 737-200 in this instance. In the early days, the company had the military MOD contract, and so we would fly to places like Gibraltar or all the frontline bases in Germany and Holland, and even went, before the wall came down, through the corridor to RAF Gatto, which was good fun. But I spent 30 years with Britannia, which then became Thomson Fly, which then became Thomson's, and now of course is TUI, and ended up flying basically all the marks of 7.3s, 7.5s and 7.6s, and short, medium and long haul. You know, so it was great fun. So that's a bit of my flying career as in a nutshell. But let's set the scene for tonight's chat about my time in Africa as a bush pilot. As I said, I spent a year at least trying to look for a job. It was the downturn in the industry, fuel crisis and all the rest of it. And my best friend had gone to Kenya to stay with his grandmother in a place called Naivasha, Lake Naivasha. And was telling me all these fun things that he was doing, and said, "Don't happen to be any jobs, flying jobs over there?" And eventually he called me back and said, "Yeah, I've got you a job flying a Cessna 310 for a construction firm." So that was it. Packed my bags and shot across to there. I had 364 hours when I arrived, and they needed 1,000 for the insurance. So it was with my logbook and license in hand, I went to Nairobi to a big general aviation airfield called Wilson Airport, and knocked on doors, started at one end and worked my way down to the other. And at the far end, the outfit called Air Kenya, the chief pilot said, "Well, actually, we do have a job. We need a pilot to fly a Cherokee 6, which is like your little training Cherokees, but on steroids, for an outfit based in the coast. And because of AOCs and ownership and all the rest of it, it's a little bit of a hodgepodge of who you'll actually be working for, but generally it'll be down on the coast." So with I had to undergo the usual getting my license converted and sitting all the different exams, etc. But excuse me, passed all of that and ended up heading down to the coast. And just as an aside, this is a photograph taken from where I lived in Naivasha on this lake, and this was a view at the bottom of the garden. So Mombasa Air Services was the outfit I was working for. It had a main base in Mombasa, and it also had another sort of subsidiary airline called Malindi Air Services, but the same thing, at a place called Malindi. We had at least 12 aeroplanes, and probably at any one time about 25 full-time freelance pilots, and they came from Canada, England, Holland, Germany, Switzerland, even had some Japanese pilots. So it was a real mishmash. And when we joined the company, you were provided with uniforms and 100-mile-an-hour tape. Some of you might not be familiar with that, but it's a bit like metallic gaffer tape, but it's strong aluminium and sticky stuff that are really impressive. And we were given a little roll of that of about 3 meters length. And it was amazing what you could do to patch an aeroplane up to get back home. And of course, we all had this stuff, so there was lots of this 100-mile-an-hour tape to play with. But we'd need a torch, a night stop kit, obviously. A kikoi is basically the Kenyan version of a sarong, and the good old Swiss Army knife. It's amazing how much of an aeroplane you can dismantle with a Swiss Army knife, and how much you can put back together as a Swiss Army knife and 100-mile-an-hour tape. But the maps were a problem. There were no aviation maps as such. The best ones that we could get were ones called the Kenyan tourist road maps. And they were by far the best bit of kit we had. We'd draw on the location of various beacons and frequencies and the odd direction and headings and distances for to to get to certain thresholds from various key landmarks. As for the charts, there were no things like Jepsons or ARADs that were any use to us. The photocopies that we were given were about 7 or 8 years out of date. And on my arrival at the coast, I got checked out on the Cherokee 6, and the boss said, let's check you out on the Seneca, and we'll do your instrument rating at the same time. So we were barreling all through it, and the last part of that exercise is, for those of you who are familiar with it, is single engine approach and go around. So there I am into the go around, and the battling away, great. This is at Mombasa, and the boss said words to the effect of, "Oh, I say, old chap, this is a bit rather spiffing. May I take control?" Well, it was kind of like that, but there's a whole lot of expletives that you'd have to replace. And he snatched control out of me, and eventually gave it to me back downwind and said, "Land it." And so we landed and got into the office, and he said, "What the hell were you doing on the go-around?" I said, showed him in the chart, and the go-around said, execute a left claiming turn. And what anybody had realized was that since the chart had been printed, they'd built a huge control tower in the missed approach path about the size of the one at Manchester or at Heathrow. So poor old Seneca 1 on a single engine was not going to climb very fast, and apparently the controllers were all diving for cover as we went past. So that was the quality of the maps and charts that we had to put up with. But our company was basically a charter firm. Our main bread and butter was working for a company called the African Safari Club, which were bringing tourists up to the game park. Now, these tourists mostly arrived on this stylishly painted DC-8. Most of them came from Germany, but there were French, Italian, Swiss. The English didn't start arriving until sort of the very end of my period there, and they would come in on the British Air Tours flights. But so there was quite a selection of people, and normally what would happen, they'd go away, book a safari for either 1, 2, or 3 day safaris, or sometimes 4. And our fleet consisted of obviously the Cherokee 6s. I've mentioned the Senecas. There are 2 types of Senecas we had. The Alpha Tango is a Seneca 1, which has got normally aspirated engines, and the Seneca 2, which has got bigger engines, and it's also got the luxury of turbochargers. And because of the altitudes that we were operating out of, this could make quite a difference. We also had Cessna 402s, like the one you saw me standing beside before. We had a Navajo and also some Islanders. So it's quite a big fleet. Now, what I tend to do tonight is I'll take you through the sort of the bread and butter route that we used to fly, which we used to call the daily departure, which was from the coast up to the Masai Mara and back. And we'll go through this leg by leg, if you like. So what would happen, you'd normally wake up, start the day about 6 o'clock when the sun rose, shuffle off to work. I lived in a company house, and it took me about 3 minutes to get to work. Our base was the old terminal, and they usually had all the fleet parked at it. There were a couple of other companies that were in competition, but they'd only have 1 or 2 aircraft apiece. And we'd normally have been given our tasks for the day, whether we were picking passengers up from Mombasa, or whether we would be picking them up from Malindi or the Strip of Kunda. It's you would go to work, do the pre-flight on the airplane, do the paperwork, go back into the terminal, have a chat. Normally the senior pilot around would sort of wet his finger, stick it up in the air and say, I think 5 degrees drift today, boys, would do it. And because there was no weather forecast, no NOTAMs. And to be honest, the whole rule of the exercise was the only law that we obeyed was the law of gravity, and that was given a run for its money normally. But if I can just show you on a map here. Now, obviously, this is Africa. Here's Kenya here. We'll spin into Mombasa. So there's Mombasa there. The airport's just out here on by this little estuary here. And down here you can see the little place called Akunda. Now, there was nothing there really. There's a whole load of hotels along the coastline, which we would take passengers from. The Akunda Airstrip was quite interesting, would be a good word to use. When it was built, the people who built it said that they built a lot of runways. In fact, they built a lot of car drives, and this was no different. It was a nice, smooth piece of tarmac, to be sure, but the width was a little bit intriguing. On the 402, which had the widest wheelbase, you had 3 inches on either side to play with. So they made it a little bit sporty in a crosswind. And on the edge of the seal, you had about a 3 or 4 inch drop off. So if you ever dropped a wheel off the tarmac, you'd be into the boondoe quicker than you could say Jake. Well, from Akunda, we'd pick up our passengers, and then we would head off and fly up country. We'd pass Mount Kilimanjaro and head on up here to the Ambiselli Game Park. Now, if I just zoom in here, you can see the runway there. It was finally sealed during my period there, and here's the lodge that we would stay at. So just bear with me while I get back to... So this is en route. We're, needless to say, this is Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest peak in Africa, just over 19,000 feet high. It's in Tanzania because Queen Victoria gifted it to her cousin, the Kaiser, as a birthday present, I believe. But because Kenya already had another high peak. But flying along, the weather would be, go from the sublime to the ridiculous would be the best way to describe it. And looking out the window, you would judge your distance away from there and your position, and close the throttles. And after a while, you got so good at judging it that you'd probably not touch the throttles until you were taxiing in at the other end. There's a story here. One day I was chugging along here, and a lady tourist sitting in the co-pilot seat started tugging my sleeve. And I looked across at her, and she was sort of pressed up against the wall and sort of pointing madly out the window. So half expecting to see one of my colleagues sort of doing a flyby past me, but no, there was nothing there, couldn't see anything going on. So I carried on with my paperwork. But a minute or so later, she's prodding me quite violently in the ribs. So I spun round and glared at her, and there she was, curled up in a little ball in the seat, and sort of pointing wildly at the window, and her eyes out on organ stops. Stupid woman. Looked around at her family and friends in the back of the plane, and they're all sitting there white-faced and wide-eyed. What's going on? Just then I caught some movement, and I looked up, and about the size of my hand expanded wide, was this big red spider, hairy, lots of eyes and coral red. Well, I have to say I did flinch, and everyone sort of let out a mild squeal. I did make the mistake then of calling up my colleagues and asking any of them if they knew this thing was poisonous, because animals that color are usually that color for a reason. But I didn't get any reply, save one. And one of the guys just said, "You're doomed, laddie, you're doomed." So it was a case of, okay, I'm number one, get out of the way. So I full power all the way down and eventually got rid of this spider at the... So that didn't happen too often. Now, we're talking about this clearing the strip. So that needs a little bit of explanation. The runways are always clear, and the animals used to like being on the runways clear, because especially if the grass was long, because there was no predators, or they could see the predators. So, and it was sometimes a nice warm place to stand, or they had good views. So quite often you would arrive and have to clear the strip, and it could be anything from little gazelles to, as you see here, elephants. And the way that you'd go about it was that you would go flat out down to as low as you dare go. So you were just above the wildlife, and go racing down the strip. And when you got to the end of the runway, you chop the power, bank 45 degrees to the right, and pitch up to 35, 40 degrees. And as the speed bled back past the limits for the gear and the flap, you would select gear down, full flap, and then commence what amounts to basically a jondelle. How aggressive you would be on that maneuver would depend on how quickly you think that the animals were going to get back onto the strip. So if there was long grass, you needed to be pretty quick, and you would probably end up inverted as part of the procedure. And as the ground appeared on the way down, you could adjust the angle of bank to line up with the strip, and you could also use power to adjust your glide path. You'd all be lined up probably around about 100, 150 feet up. You check that you had 3 greens, your wheels were down, you had full flaps, the propellers were up full so you could go around. You would then check to make sure that the strip was clear, and you would go in and land. If the strip wasn't clear, then the plan was that you would clean up, gear up, flaps up, full power, race back down the strip again, low level, and do the same procedure at the other end. Now, my personal best was 3 times I'd had to do that before I got rid of a reluctant animal. But some days you'd arrive and there wouldn't be anything there. Once on the ground, this is the Ambiselli Strip. You can see these aren't actually our fleet aircraft, but it's not very big, and with sometimes most of the fleet there, it was quite a busy place. You'd get the passengers out and take them across to the waiting safari buses, usually V-dub combis, and then you'd go off, pay the park fees for everybody at the game park office, and then climb in the bus and head off to the lodge. The tourists would have a quick comfort stop and then head out on their safari, and we'd head off for breakfast. The main thing to see at Ambiselli is the elephants. And you could tell by the time of year how far the snow went up and down on Mount Kilimanjaro. You can see the acacia trees here. Sometimes the cloud, it was foggy there, and which could pose a few problems. Other times the cloud base could be basically on the top of the acacias, and we would just come in low level below the tops of the trees. But you have to be a little bit careful with that, because the problem was giraffes. Now, you know, giraffes are quite big animals, quite tall, but occasionally they do bend down to have a drink of water. They spread their legs and dip their heads down. So you can imagine what would happen if you've got, you're flying between two acacias and there's a drinking giraffe in the middle. He suddenly hears the noise of the engines and sort of sticks his head up and looks around and goes, "What's that noise?" And suddenly this gap that you were planning on going through suddenly disappears. So it's tricky. Now this was the Ambiselli Lodge. It's basically T-shape, and this wing here is the restaurant where you have where we had our breakfast. The reception area was in the middle area, and then the other wing was the bar. This wing here is where the lounge was. And I remember one morning arriving and the staff were all excited. And I said, "Oh, what's happened? What's gone on?" And they said, "Oh, Bonnie, you should have been here last night." I said, "Oh, what happened?" They said, "Oh, this big line came in to reception." "Really?" "Yeah, I had a look at the girls at reception, and then it stuck its head in the bar and then wandered out through the lounge and jumped over the balcony and walked off. We had a lot of spilt drinks," yes, as you can imagine. I don't know if any of the sharp-eyed of you have noticed that the chappie in the bottom right-hand corner of that postcard. That was a charter flight we did with the model and the photographer. We went to a couple of the lodges. So a chap's a chap. He's got to do what he's got to do, really. Okay, I'll just have a sip of my tea. Excuse me. Now the second sector is from Ambiselli to the Masai Mara, or Governor's Camp. Now most of the aircraft didn't have the fuel range to do it direct, so the rest of the fleet would have to go off to Nairobi, to this GA Airfield Wilson, to refuel. And if I can just show you this on the map. So here we are at Ambiselli. It's mostly a northerly track that takes us up to Nairobi. The weather could be, as I say, from the sublime to the ridiculous. The most bad part of it was in the dry season, where the farmers would be burning off, the poachers would be setting fire to the land to flush the animals out, and you were actually flying in a brown milk bottle. The only ground that you could see was what you could see directly between the engine and the fuselage. So just looking down, you couldn't see anything ahead but various shades of brown. And the trick was to stay away from the dark brown bits because they would smart. The route into Wilson would take us through the Nairobi National Park. Here's the main international airport up here, Jomo Kenyatta. And so because of the ILS and the approach there, we were limited to not above 500 feet over here. And that posed some serious risks for us. Birds were a big problem. I'll show you one in just a little while what we were up against. Birds on your level or below you were not a problem. Birds above you, and certainly above you and ahead of you, were a real threat, because as soon as the birds saw you, they would close their wings up and drop and right into you. Just as an aside, one of my pals was flying Cessna Centurion, which is a single-engine, high-wing, retractable gear aeroplane, through this route, and a vulture came through the windscreen and knocked him unconscious, but actually scalped him. And amazingly, the other side of his brain crash landed the aeroplane, chopped the power and crash landed it into the game park. And they all survived, which was an amazing story. And so we fly into Nairobi, into Wilson. Now that's 5,500 feet. So there are certainly density altitude concerns when we go into here. So if I come back to share. Now this is a marabou stalk. Now, marabous are about 4 to 5 feet high. So if you hit one of those, you're in big trouble. And there was one took a beach baron, hit it in the tail and knocked the tail off it. And needless to say, that was a non-survivable. Now this is on approach into Wilson. It's quite a downslope on this main runway. And just around here is the Aero Club, which was a great place to hole up when you're on a maintenance night stop. Had many a good party there. We would go in there, refuel, and then blast straight off again. I was taking off one day in one of the Seneca 2s, the ones with the turbocharged engines, and just on rotation, the turbine seized on the turbocharger. So he ended up having an asymmetric engine on one side, on the left-hand side, and a normally aspirated, and a turbocharged engine on the right. So the airplane immediately wanted to head off to the left. So it was because we were full of fuel, full of passengers. Although the Senecas carried, was supposed to be 6 up, we used to put 7 in them, the little middle seat. It was sort of a kiddie seat, and we used to squeeze a small adult into that. So we were, and just overnight bags. So it was quite tight. We cleared the boundary fence and then turned around to the right. And this big white thing here that I'm highlighting is called a drive-in movie screen, big concrete thing. And I remember looking at the top of that as I went past, sort of eyeball to eyeball with it. So allowing for that and the fact that this slopes uphill, my options were to sort of carry straight on and go to the international airport, and that would have been all sorts of grief, or struggle round and get back onto the runway. I declared an emergency, and the controller immediately told me to call the boundary outbound. I told him again that I'd lost an engine and I was in distress. And once again, he came back and told me quite forthrightly that I was to call leaving the zone boundary. So at which stage the couple of Aero Club aeroplanes in the circuit said, yeah, we're out of here. And I could see their bomb bursting out of the way and left it to me. So the only time the controller spoke to me again was when I called him as clear of the runway. But normally things weren't so exciting, and we'd head off, and I will show you the map again. So here we are at Nairobi. What's the interesting bit here is it's very uphill. There's a big escarpment along here and a range of hills. And this is the Rift Valley that you've probably heard about. If I can just take a moment just as a little aside, because we'll come back to it. This is Lake Naivasha. This is the place which was my home from home when I lived there. I would normally stay with my friend's grandmother, and normally we lived there. Her husband and her built a hotel, which is now the Country Club. And what was interesting, in those days, they used to put the crews and passengers from the Empire flying boats up. And because they would have an early departure the next morning. because it's 6,000 feet up here, they would like to take off early in the morning, i.e. just after sunrise. Because there was no wind around and the lake was flat calm, they would have to have about 3 or 4 speedboats to go racing backwards and forwards across the lake to set up a chop. Otherwise, the surface tension would keep the flying boat stuck to the lake, and they would need a little bit of air to break the seal so that they could get away. And I'll talk about this little road here in a little bit later on as well. But getting back on track, so we would go from Nairobi across the Rift Valley, which goes for thousands of miles through Africa, a big fault full of extinct and active volcanoes. And we'd fly to what's known as the Masai Mara. Now that's the Kenyan end of the Serengeti Plains. And if I can just find it. Oops. Just bear with me. There we go. Governor's Camp. Now that was our main destination, and here's the airstrip that we would be flying into. Come back. All is forgiven. Now this is a view of the Rift Valley taken from the escarpment, as it was called. As you can see, it's quite a sizable drop, and the floor of the valley would vary anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 feet. And we used to operate out of a strip that was 10,000 feet that we'd have to take off at midday. So that was sporty. The Maasai warrior there is one of the indigenous population. And it was occasionally a problem that we would have, where some of the ladies, the single ladies in our party, would fall for one of these Maasai warriors and not want to come home. So there was a real rigmarole of getting paperwork signed of disclaimers and all the rest of it. A real hassle. But a lot of the lakes in the Rift Valley have got flamingos in them. And so when you fly over them at altitude, you could just see this rim of pink around them. Very pretty. This is this Crescent Island I was talking about. And has, as you can see here, a Thomson gazelle, some bushbuck, a waterbuck, and a zebra. The little bit of land that I pointed out to you, used to flood occasionally, and that was the location for the film The African Queen, a little bit before my time, but that was there. And this part was where some of Born Free was filmed. The author, or proposed author of that book, Born Free, was written by Joy Adamson, who lived just on the other side of the lake. She actually stole the book from her husband, who was a fantastic guy. But in the drier part of the year, a lot of these lakes are soda lakes, and they would turn this pink color, very concentrated soda. So now we're in the Masai Mara, the inevitable CB that's dying away in the evening. It's, as I said, it's the Kenya end of the Serengeti Plains, so it's very rich in wildlife. When we'd arrive, normally on these daily departures, we would drop off one load of passengers and pick up another load. But in the off-season, we would spend the night here. And if you were night stopping out in the bush, you used to have to take special precautions. Now, the first thing that you would do would be to dip the tanks to get a really accurate fuel figure. You'd put the pitot covers on and just put the plane to bed. If you'd remembered, you'd brought a can of insect spray and you'd spray around the wheels. It's not that the insects would go for the wheels, but the hyenas and the lions used to like to use the tires as chew toys, and they didn't like the taste of the bug spray, so you'd sometimes get away with it. And the 402 that I showed you earlier had just come out of a major overhaul when I first got it, so it was pristine. And my first night at governor's camp, in the morning we went out to pre-flight the airplanes before breakfast, and I saw all these little red bits on the road. I thought, what's that? And then realized they were part of my telltale for my Peter head covers. And when we got to the airplane, we'd find that a hyena had chewed off one of the gear doors as well. So that was rather annoying. But you would also have in the morning to dip the tanks again and see if there was any discrepancy. It didn't happen in my time there, but one of the guys had a discrepancy, and by searching the bush surrounding where the airplane was parked, they found one of the locals dead in the bush, and he'd obviously figured a way out how to get the fuel out and had drunk it raw. So that didn't have done them any good. So when we got to the camp, this is your accommodation for the night. It sits on a concrete pad that's covered by the tent fly, and you can see the chairs and the table there. There's this little tent, zip in it. There's a bed on both sides, single bed, a little table with candles and torch. Behind that is a little dressing table and a little lashed together wood to make something to hang your clothes up on. There's a zip at the other end, and that took you into about a 3-foot gap to another wee small tent, and in that tent was a toilet, basin rather, and a shower. Now, when I first went there, I would zip up the tent, but one night I got woken with the tent shaking like billy-o, and I realized it was a water buffalo eating the bush underneath the tent fly, and he'd got his horns hooked on the tent fly and was giving the whole thing a good shaking. Well, that sort of concerned me if he'd have got a fright and run off and dragged me with it. So after that, I vowed to sleep with the zips open. But a couple of months later, I got up in the morning and was heading out to brush my teeth, and I noticed in the little gap, in the 3-foot gap, some leopard pad marks. He'd walked across the wet grass and then across the dry concrete. And he'd obviously stopped, stuck his head in the tent to have a look, and then carried on walking. So I thought, oh God, now what do I do? So I thought, oh, I'll split the difference. So I'll sleep with one zip up and one down. But a few months later, I was woken again by these chairs and the table being moved in the middle of the night. Beautiful moonlight night. So I climbed out of bed and sat on the end of the bed looking through the window. And there, playing with the chairs, was a little baby elephant. He was probably about 2 weeks old, so he hadn't got use of his trunk. That was sort of waggling around, and he looked like a well-worn yard brush, just all these little bristles. My first concern was, where's Mum? But then I could hear her rumbling gently just nearby, and I thought, well, she can smell me, and as long as I don't do anything stupid, we're okay. So we watched Junior play for a little while, and then he and Mum headed off. In the evening, we'd have dinner, and then once the loopies, as we called the tourists, had gone to bed, we'd sit around the campfire with the manager and special guests and some of the staff, and put good use to the beers and the whiskies. And you could tell where the camp stopped and where the Africa started is where they stopped cutting the grass. On this particular night, I was sitting there and thinking, I've got this funny feeling I'm being looked at. And I looked around, and about 3 or 4 meters away was this big male lion just standing there in the firelight. But, oh, okay. And he sauntered around the edge of the firelight and then just sauntered off into the bush. So he downed our glasses and filled them up again. The Mara River flows through the campsite, if you like, and it's full of crocs and also hippos. Now, the hippos are actually one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. They kill more people than everything else put together. They are fearsome animals. And you wouldn't believe, looking at a path through the grass, it's probably less than 6 inches wide, and that's a hippo trail. You can't have photographs of Africa and not have a giraffe eating a thorn tree. But as you can imagine, what I was saying before, if it's having a drink of water and you know, it's been quite low. And the water buffaloes are probably the next most dangerous animal in Africa. That's probably this little swine that ate my gear door. But you get your eye in. When you first arrive in Africa, you know, my friend was saying, oh, look, there's a giraffe, 100 meters away. No, I can't see it. And then you're right, you get the eyes accustomed, and then you can pick out things like this, a cheetah hiding in the grass. And just some more wildlife shots I've taken. I had a tourist come to me one day after a game drive nursing a black eye, and the driver hit me, the driver hit me. I said, what happened? Well, I only went out to the van to pat the nice little lion cub. They look so sweet. And he hit me. I thought, well, yeah, you're lucky you're here, lady. They brought balloons in at the latter part to do flying safaris early in the morning. But one of the highlights, and probably one of the wonders of the world, is the wildebeest migration. There are literally millions of these animals, and they extend for miles, and it's just stunning to watch. If we were night stopping and we could go on our own game safari, not with the tourists, which was a tick exercise on the different animals, we could go away and just go and see lions or something like that. But in the wildebeest migration, we used to love going down to the river, and you'd watch them all milling around, mooing and all the rest of it. And then one would make a go for it, or normally what would happen, one would get nudged over the edge and fall over, and the rest would follow. And it would like lemmings just cascading over the bank and across the river. And the river was full of crocs waiting for them, or not. We used to have a big old tree that had fallen down and was half submerged in the river. And the bodies of the wildebeest would come down and get stuck on this tree. Then the next body would come down and get kind of wedged on that and would lift that carcass up a little bit. And then another one would come down and lift them up a bit. Well, if I kid you not, that the stack of bodies on top of this tree was up to 12 to 15 feet high. So you can imagine how many bodies there were, and they were just drowners. But it was a breathtaking scene. Now this was a real problem for us pilots. In the midday, when we were getting ready to go, we would have the problem if there was any lions around. Lions don't like the sun, and they will sit in whatever shade they can find. And what produces shade better than an aeroplane? Now, if you were quick and you saw some lions hanging around the strip when you landed, you would be going up to your passengers and saying, it'd be really helpful if you wanted to see some lions, if you could have a quick lunch and leave a little bit earlier than what they say. So if you were lucky and they behaved themselves and did what you asked, you'd arrive at the airplane to find this. And with a judicious banging on the side and beeping of horns and all the rest of it, they would reluctantly get up and go and flop down underneath the wing of the plane next to you. the next part of the exercise was that you would have to get the vehicle to back up to the nose of the aeroplane. Me, would have to get out of the aeroplane and start loading the bags. And when you're half a wingspan away from a line that can cover that distance in the blink of an eye, you're putting bags in with one eye and looking over your shoulder with the other. But if the passengers were not playing ball and were a bit tardy, and you arrived at the strip and you were the last plane there, it would take a long time. It's an hour and a half's my record to get rid of the lines from under. Now I'm just looking at the time. It's 8 o'clock and we've got a little bit more to go. Are you happy for me to continue, or would you like to continue this on another day?
I think everyone's enjoying it so far. Any objections? I think
absolutely not. Carry on if you can.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So now we've got rid of the lines. We've got our passengers loaded. We've all had a lovely lunch, and we blast off on the next stage, which is from the Masai Mara to Savo West to a place called Kiligoni. Let's have a look at the map. So here we are at Governors. Our routing this time will take us back down, once again over the Rift Valley, down past Kilimanjaro to these Chuli Hills, and then down into the Savo West Game Park. Here's the strip at Kiligoni, or as we would call it, is Kilaluni. And here's the lodge that we would go to. Now, as you can imagine, you've had a nice lunch. It's nice and warm. There's the drone of the engines, and so hardly the wheels were in the wheel well when the passengers were starting to nod off. For the pilots, we didn't have autopilots, but you would end up in this situation where time seemed to disappear. If a needle flicked on the instrument panel, you'd see it, or if an airliner flew away overhead, you'd spot that. But 9 times out of 10, you'd suddenly come around and go, where am I? And the aeroplane was bang on track, and you'd look around, and 99% of the time you would be, oh, it's time to descend, and close the throttles, and down you would go. But I have to say my personal best was I came around, if you like, and sort of looked around, and I was going to Governor's Camp, and I didn't recognize where I was, and looked down and suddenly realized there was Governor's Camp below the strip below me, 10,000 feet down. I thought, oops. But I did have a get out of jail free card for that, because the boss had overshot his target one day by 2 hours and had to stop to refuel to get back. But as I said, we passed Kilimanjaro on the way back. The number of times the German tourists would say, it's the Himalayas, yeah? Yeah, okay. But as I say, it's 19,500 feet high, Kili. I flew over it once to have a look without oxygen, and it looks like a bit of a chimney in the central core. I was a bit worried though. One of my colleagues in another outfit had done it in the Navajo, and he'd cracked the windscreen because of the cold. Oops. This is Kiligoni Airstrip. It's compacted earth, and which made it a bit slippery when it was raining, and we used to get various problems with wildlife because of the closeness of the bush. Very early on in my stage there was an ostrich partway down the strip, and there were some of my colleagues coming into land. I said, oh, don't worry, I'll get rid of the ostrich. So full power, take off, and just lifted the airplane high enough to bring the wheels up and just kept going towards this ostrich. And so suddenly this ostrich stuck his head on the ground. I thought, I only thought they did that in cartoons. And by then, I suddenly realized the other brain cell kicked into touch, and I realized I was pointing directly at its bum, and it was about time that I pull up. So fortunately, I missed it, and he did run away. But the one day I was landing, and one of these things walked across in front of me. It's called a monitor lizard. Now, they can grow to some old size, and this particular one was huge. He was about 3 feet, I suspected, to the top of his back. And I thought, wow, if I hit that with a nose wheel, it would be a goner, or any of the wheels, to be honest. So I aerodynamically braked. I had to stick right back and got the nose wheel just over it. And I felt a bump as the right wheel lifted, and I must have run over his tail and brushed his nose with the other one. But yes, some of the animals you don't expect. But these are the Jewel Hills, very volcanic. And the soil around here is this very red color. The elephants, bathe in the stuff, so they turn that color. The interesting thing, in the dry season, when there isn't so much water around, the elephants turn pink. So yes, I have seen pink elephants and not been drunk. Nearby is a place called Mozema Springs, which is a big springs, and it's where Mombasa gets its water from. The story of the ostriches, just told you that. I once hit an ostrich, so when we had stories at work, about what's the biggest bird you've ever hit? I used to win hands down when I used to say, well, it was an ostrich. So we'd have afternoon tea there, and then we would then head home. So if I bring up the next map again. So the Savo Game Park is about the size of Wales, to give you a sort of a comparison. So from Kiligoni, we'd fly down towards the coast and normally back to Mombasa, occasionally Malindi, but normally back to Mombasa. And the passengers would then get the bus back across. Now this route was the one that used to cause me all the weather problems. My very first trip in the Cherokee 6, there was just myself and a pilot from another company, the most experienced pilot on the coast at the time, and we were doing an Ambiselli Kiligoni flight. And the weather got really black and dark and thundery and lightningy, and we could hear the rest of the fleet overflying Kiligoni and just heading straight to the coast. And so there was just the two of us there, and I said, well, what do we do now? And he said, oh, don't worry about it. He said, just take off, fly on this heading, climb up to about 5,000 feet, and eventually you'll pop out of the cloud and there'll be Mombasa. So off I went. Got lots of this, which is called St. Elmo's fire. So it's really pretty, and you get it arcing off the propeller as well if it's really active. You're then sort of waiting for the lightning to strike because you've built up quite a big static charge on the aeroplane. And but that didn't happen today. Unfortunately, on this particular day, it wasn't rough either. However, it did get a bit lighter from the black that we'd come through with all the lightning and thunder noises. But I could see from the DME that we weren't that far away from the coast when suddenly a hole appeared, and I looked down this hole and I could see where the water pipes that fed Nairobi from Mozema Springs were, where they just approached the escarpment. So I thought, oh, I know where I am. So down I spiraled, got down to the bottom of this hole and found the cloud base probably about 300 feet high. But as I crossed over the escarpment and down into Mombasa, into the coastal plain, the cloud base went down. I ended up flying past the runway, and I could look up at the runway end. I could see the stanchions of approach lights as I went past. So I went down into the harbour where I could turn around and fly back. And basically, a mild 90-degree wing over got me onto the runway. But even taxiing, I felt like the tail was in the top of the clouds, or in the bottom of the clouds rather. And there was a very agitated boss looking very relieved when I taxied in. And it was the worst storm they'd seen in over 7 years. And my other colleague arrived about an hour and a half later, so I did pretty well. But there was another run-in I had with a CB, which nearly broke the wing off the aeroplane. But that's another story for another day. The southeast to Mombasa. Oh, I've gone the wrong way, sorry. Oops. This is Mombasa, downtown Mombasa, the famous tusks. Beers. There are two types of beers in Kenya, if you ever go there. One's called White Cap, the other one's called Tusker. You drink White Cap on the coast and Tusker up country. It's got to be something to do with the altitude. No one knew why, but if you drank them the other way around, they tasted horrible. But not that we tried it very often, but it was, they were a nice brew. And one of the luxuries that we had working in an old terminal was the bar was still there. And they had opened the bar up each night for our arrival, just for us pilots. So a very civilized way to end the day. Well, I've got this crock in as a reminder for an incident that happened at one of the lodges up country. But I'll, if you'd like, we could save that for another day. Oops. The end. Now this photograph was taken at my home from home in Naivasha, and there is no filters or editing done on that. That as is what it was like.